Hello, my name's Christopher Green. I'm a lecturer in Korean Studies at the University of Leiden here in the Netherlands. I want to talk to you briefly today about South Korea's economic response to the COVID-19 pandemic. When we talk about South Korea and COVID-19, we're normally talking about a medical, technological, and social response to the crisis. We're talking about widespread testing of potential COVID-19 carriers, contact tracing to see who those people have met and where they've been. Apps, smartphone apps, to deliver some of that information to other people who may therefore be at risk, and localized shutdowns of the economy and economic sectors to try and limit the need for more widespread economic measures. However, there are clear limits to this approach, and since February, Seoul has intervened in the economy several times to deliver financial packages for supporting domestic businesses and families. The fact is that South Korea's economy is export dependent. 40% of GDP is derived from exports, and the economy is bound to suffer enormously if the inevitable recession that follows in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis turns out to be prolonged. On the upside, the economy is quite well positioned to bounce back strongly if and when we see the normalization of international trade. Briefly looking at the background to South Korea's robust economic health, we find a pandemic response rooted in the memories of past crises. That is the 1997 IMF crisis, which you may know as the Asian financial crisis, and the 2008 world financial crisis. If we look at these events in turn, the 1997 IMF crisis was not a crisis of South Korea's making, but the South Korean economy was weak and vulnerable to it. Crony capitalism evolved over several decades prior to the crisis, since the early 1960s and the emergence of the quote-unquote developmental dictatorship of Park Chung-hee. Under that developmental dictatorship, crony capitalism led to very close corrupt links between industrial conglomerates known as chaebol, the banks, and the state. These left it very vulnerable, and when the central bank ran out of money in 1997, an IMF bailout had to be requested. The structural reforms, the conditions that came with that IMF bailout were very strict, and South Korea implemented them very, very well, and as a consequence, the financial health of the country rapidly improved. They closed and restructured banks, they increased capital requirements and recapitalized those which were viable, they established institutions to enhance regulation, they insured bank deposits, purchased non-performing loans, and enhanced the central bank's regulatory powers. On the industrial conglomerate side, they de-linked industry and banking once and for all. As a result, the hard currency reserves of the country, a form of insurance against future crises, increased rapidly. As you can see in the graph on the right, there was a downtick in the 2008 crisis period, but in general, the trend has been inexorably upwards. In 2008, South Korea saw a 5.1% fall in GDP in the fourth quarter of 2008, amounting to a deficit of 20% of GDP. But they turned this into a V-shaped recovery, and by the end of 2010, the country was growing at 6.2%, and the hard currency reserves continued to grow as well. By the 1st of January 2020, South Korea had no less than $408 billion in hard currency reserves. That is currently $388 billion, and it's destined to decline more, but you can see that the country was in robust financial health at the time that it entered the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic crisis. So what has South Korea done on the economic side to deal with the COVID-19 crisis? We can divide the period since February into two. The first period runs until mid-March, the second from mid-March to the present day. The overwhelming majority of the stimulus efforts, economic encouragement efforts that the South Korean government has brought in this period have been in the second half. The measures started off comparatively light, but over 4 rounds of stimulus in March and April has now seen more than $200 billion committed to stimulating the domestic economy. The government in mid-March reduced the base interest rate to 0.75% and just a few days later signed a currency swap agreement worth $60 billion with the United States Federal Reserve. It is interesting to note that part of South Korea's capacity to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic is rooted in the rapidity with which the US Federal Reserve acted to activate swap lines with 9 central banks, key central banks, allies of the United States, in a way that it did not do in 2008. On March 26th, the South Korean government announced unlimited liquidity would be provided to domestic businesses, so-called Korean quantitative easing. And on April 6th, it announced disaster relief payments, which we may know as helicopter money, direct to families, that will be delivered in mid-May, all being well. The most eye-catching of these measures were the universal emergency relief payments, 1 million won, or $820, to every household with 4 or more members in the bottom 70% income bracket. These payments are then scaled down for households with fewer members, with a one-person household, for example, receiving just 400,000 won. The money is to be provided in local gift certificates or digital currencies with an expiry date to ensure that they are spent rather than saved. South Korea has also instituted a system of support, massive support for 7 key industrial sectors: airlines, automobiles, shipbuilding, maritime shipping, machinery, power and communication, in the form of government-backed loans or syndicated loans to help them weather the storm of the collapse in demand. How successful has the South Korean measures been? If we look at the current status of the South Korean economy, we find a nasty picture. Gross domestic product decreased by 1.4%, seasonally adjusted, between January and March 2020. That is the worst the economy has seen since 2008. Private consumption collapsed by 6.4%. That is the worst since 1998. Surveys show that more than 2/3 of small and medium-sized firms are contemplating the possibility of closure and bankruptcy. Now, of course, contemplating the possibility is not the same as actually doing it, and so we must be circumspect about this data, but nevertheless, it's not a positive trend line. Finally, the economy shed 195,000 jobs in March, and all across the board, experts expect the second quarter figures to be worse. This is, of course, a picture that is mirrored all across the rich world. However, South Korea also faces some specific risks that are special for itself. The crisis exacerbates existing trends re the quote-unquote challenge of China. That is to say, China as a sectoral challenger to Korean companies in sectors such as shipbuilding, but also as an increasingly unreliable outsourcing destination and an increasingly expensive one. The benefits to South Korean firms of outsourcing to China, just like firms from anywhere else, are declining because of the cost of labor in China. On South Korea's specific docket is also the problem that it is partially dependent for its response on a robust reply by the United States, which leads me to the final point, geopolitics. South Korea is in a very difficult neighborhood, and it is dependent on China economically and the US militarily. That is a difficult position to be in, as South Korea found a few years ago when the Americans deployed a missile defense system to South Korea, and that incurred a very, very aggressive economic response from the Chinese side in complaint at the decision. What do we think the future might look like for South Korea vis-a-vis COVID-19? The highest likelihood outcome is that COVID-19 will cause significant pain at the local and the national levels. The 2008-10 rebound may look like a very positive case, but the fact is it was based on rapid normalization of global trade, and there is currently very little evidence that that kind of rapid normalization of trade will take place this time. Therefore, the export-dependent economy of South Korea will suffer for a significant period of time, and this will have knock-on effects domestically. Moreover, South Korean households are generally quite highly indebted, and they generally have relatively low savings, meaning that they lack resilience against a prolonged shutdown and will require continuing support from the state if they are to survive the probable recession to come. But again, to reiterate, the possibility of a rebound is definitely there once world economic activity resumes. So the question of whether South Korea can avoid a second peak of the disease this winter, and whether the world can in general try and mitigate the damage from COVID-19 so that world trade can resume, is a very important question for South Korea going forward. Thank you very much. That is my very brief rundown of the COVID-19 pandemic situation on the economic side in South Korea.